So hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester, and we're here tonight to talk about dealing with invasive plants and specifically dealing with invasive plants in the woods. So increasingly, unfortunately, this is something that I advise landowners on a lot, and I think got a pretty good handle on sort of what the different options are and sort of a way to think about how we do it in the most effective and efficient way possible. And if you're here, I'm sure that this is something that you've struggled with. And hopefully we can give you some light at the end of the tunnel, or at least some ideas about how to proceed. So just briefly, what county foresters do, if you haven't interacted with us in the past, is that we are the way that the state, one of the ways that the state supports private landowners. So Vermont's 75% forested. 80% of those lands are owned by people, individuals, families. And so we have a huge interest in making sure that those forests are managed really, really well. And, you know, those forests are providing us clean air and clean water and wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage, making our world beautiful and functional, giving us awesome places to go have fun and recreate. And so it's really, really important that we take care of them. There's a few different parts to this. I manage this program called the Current Use Program, which is a tax payment program for landowners with more than 25 acres. Anybody who has any kind of forested land from a few acres to thousands of acres in size can just call me up and I'll come out and we'll take a walk and talk about what's going on in your woods, how to manage it better. Invasives often come up. The third part is that I manage the town forest in the county. So in Chittenden County, that means about a dozen town forests that cover about 5,000 acres. If you're in Chittenden County, they're a really, I think, underutilized public resource. You can get to just about any of them from 45 minutes from anywhere in the county. And again, it's thousands and thousands of acres. And the fourth part is sort of answering this question of how do we improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in, you know, where we are in the county that we're in, with the people and the plants and the forests and the sort of the opportunities and threats that are here. And so dealing with invasives has been one way that I do this, because it's a massive problem all throughout the state, but becomes more of a problem in more temperate areas and more developed areas, both of which Chittenden County is. So it's sort of something I run into a lot. And I'm really excited to be able to hopefully share some tools with you for how you think about that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And away we'll go. Whoop. All right. So controlling non-native invasive plants in your forest. So what are invasive, I call them invasive exotic plants. Often we'll call them non-native invasive plants. What's a invasive exotic plant? So while there are a lot of non-native plant species in Vermont, so we have about 2,800 plant species, about 600 of those are non-native, most are not considered invasive. We actually only have 39 state-listed noxious weeds, we call them, most of which are the plants that we know and love and that you're probably struggling with right now, like buckthorn and honeysuckle and barberry and stuff like that. So they are exotic or non-native. So they're plants, animals, pests, pathogens outside of their native range. And they're invasive, which is a qualitative judgment, meaning that they are spreading prolifically in a way that's harmful. That can mean a lot of different things. It can mean that they are a threat to our safety or to our agriculture or horticulture, a variety of other things. But in this case, I'm talking about ones that are specifically harmful to our ecosystems and to our biodiversity. And that's my measure of when a plant becomes invasive. So if you've dealt with invasive plants in the past, you know that they share a few specific qualities. Excuse me. They're fast spreading. They can grow really, really quickly and really sort of exponentially. with most other plants, with most native plants, I think of them as growing at sort of this linear rate, and these invasive plants as being completely different. They're just able to seemingly occupy a huge amount of space in the blink of an eye. You take your eyes off them for 1 second, and they're gone, or they're not gone. They're totally out of control. They're generalists, which just means that they can grow just about anywhere. They are often allelopathic, so that means that they are injecting chemicals into the soil that are harmful to the growth of other plants. It can actually, following an invasive infestation, it can take a little while for the soil to recover, a few years at least, because of those chemical compounds in the soil. And an example of this is the plant garlic mustard, which specifically injects a chemical into the soil that inhibits the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi being the fungi that coexist with trees, help them extract nutrients from the soil, and also, we're learning, help them communicate with each other and share resources. It's this really sort of vital and integral part of how forests work. Garlic mustard doesn't require mycorrhizal fungi, and almost all of our native plants do. And so by injecting this chemical that inhibits its growth, they're able to take over. Almost all of our native, non-native invasive plants are extremely resilient. So they're skilled at layering, which just means they're good at sprouting from little pieces of stem and root. They can often reproduce vegetatively, so clone themselves by sprouting. And they're just really, really, really good at staying alive, hard to kill. If you've tried, you know. Many of them also seed prolifically. So they produce seeds, often seeds in a berry that is ingested by wildlife and is transported long distances. And in general, they are without the predators, the parasites, the environmental constraints that are within their native habitat. You can think of them as being released from their evolutionary constraints. I first heard it described that way in the amazing book by Elizabeth Colbert, The Sixth Extinction, where she describes invasives as being sort of released from the bonds, the constraints of evolution. And the way that you can sort of think about it is that when species evolve, they evolve not in response or in relation to all the species in the world, but just to the species and the environmental conditions that are proximal to them. So the ones that they're actually interacting with. There's no reason why they would adapt to something that isn't there. And so that's why you have weird stuff like New Zealand, which has no native land mammals except for bats, which was devastated by the introduction of rats and livestock. They were, those systems just didn't have those things there, and so they were completely devastated by the introduction of something novel that was able to really disrupt their ecosystems. Other examples are that, in other parts of the world, things that are pretty benign here are incredibly invasive. So we have native trees native to Vermont, like red oak and yellow birch and black cherry, that are horrible invasives in Europe. Minks are a horrible invasive animal in Europe. Rabbits are in Australia. If you've heard about the infamous rabbit-proof fence, rabbits are something that, here it's a bunny, right? Over there, those ecosystems are not adapted to deal with it. And there's no reason why they would be. And so it becomes a huge biodiversity threat. So why do we care? In a nutshell, the main reason why we care is that these non-native invasive plants displace our native plants. In doing that, they affect this whole different web of organisms. So each of one of our native organisms is not an island, but it's part of an ecosystem. And there are connections and relationships that are really, really important to the whole. I sort of think about a forest not just as a bunch of trees, but as this massive web of life. And the more we learn about them, we learn that it's important to protect the forest as a whole and all of the different organisms and the processes that are part of that forest, not just because those things are cool and because we like them, but because they're actually part of what makes that system work and what makes it vital, what makes it resilient. And so anytime you displace a native organism, you're displacing not just that organism, but by proxy, all of those other organisms that have a relationship with that organism. There are some acute impacts that invasive plants have. So the big ones that people always think about are that they have berries that are less nutritious for wildlife. In the case of like our neotropical or migratory songbirds, they're going to be spending a lot of time and energy foraging on these berries that aren't good for them, when they could be foraging on more nutritious native berries. And that can be very dangerous for them as they embark upon a thousands of mile long migration. Another thing which is sort of harder to conceptualize is that the non-native invasive plants also harbor a much lower invertebrate density and diversity. So invertebrates, essentially bugs, are the base of our forest food web, and they're also a really, really important part of what makes forests work in a bunch of different ways, turning organic material into soil, feeding larger organisms that we do know and love, like birds. And so that is actually a profound threat. It's just less obvious to our ecosystems, that they have much lower amounts of those invertebrates. And there's other little impacts that we notice that sort of our ears prick up, that get our attention, like that Japanese barberry is associated with really, really high tick density. And so in places where you have an infestation of Japanese barberry, you tend to have a lot more ticks. And that's actually true for a lot of these invasive plants, or plants like or organisms like the Lymantria dispar, the LDD, what we used to call gypsy moth, that defoliated a bunch of people's woods and also dropped poop all over their houses and freaked them out and grossed them out. And poison parsnip, which causes people and their kids to get these really nasty burns on them. So so all those things are really, really important and worth mentioning. But I think, to me, what's the scariest part of these invasive plants is that they just prevent our forests from being forests. They prevent this whole giant, changing, dynamic, resilient volume of life from being able to grow and develop naturally. Providing habitats for all of our native organisms, which are contained not just within or that are supported not just by our native plants, but also by the processes of our forests as they change, and they prevent our forests from doing that. Our ecosystems are very, very resilient. They're defined by their resilience, but they're also delicate in a way. We care because non-native plants, animals, pests, and pathogens are also a major threat to global biodiversity. So along with habitat loss and climate change, they're considered one of the major threats globally to our biodiversity. Invasive organisms, what we call biological invasions, account for about half of all extinctions of which the cause is known. And we think that about 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by their interaction with invasives. And you see a picture here of the brown tree snake, which has caused essentially all of Guam's forest bird species to go extinct. We care because these non-native invasive plants are yet another one of many human-caused stressors on our ecosystems. So because of the really profound and real threats of climate change, we're tempted to just focus on climate change, but really what we should be thinking about is what we call global change. So global change is the combined stressors, which include climate change, altered natural disturbance regimes, these non-native biological invasions, forest loss, forest fragmentation, the splitting up of forests into smaller and smaller pieces, pollution, and more. So as our forests and our other ecosystems are moving into the future, they're not just encountering climate change, they're encountering this entire mass of things. And as I'll mention probably multiple times, we're in the middle of sort of a number of different ecological crises simultaneously. We're in a climate crisis, we're in a biodiversity crisis. And so we need to, as we're thinking about different solutions, it really needs to be a balance to address all of those different things. We need to help our ecosystems recover from what's happened in the past. And then at the same time, we're also trying to manage them for a different future, which we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I promise that this will not be this depressing for the whole time, but it will be for right now. So we care because these changes that are occurring on our landscape and which are causing these all these massive problems to our ecosystems and our wildlife are directly attributable to human behavior. So even if you didn't do it, we did. So it's pretty bleak. I mean, we're in this time period. It's a geologic era that we're now calling the Anthropocene, in which humans are the dominant influence on our climate and on our ecology. We're in the middle of this, what we call the sixth extinction, a massive global constriction of biodiversity. Global animal populations are 68% lower than they were in 1970. That means that there are 68% less animals on the planet now than there were 50 years ago. Not 50% of the species, 50% of the actual animals. And we have this extinction rate, which is really, really high. We think like about 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, which includes 40% of amphibians, 33% of reforming corals, a third of all marine mammals. We think we've lost about 700 vertebrate species since the 16th century rather. Invertebrates, bugs again, which I'll talk about a few times, which make up about 97% of all the species on Earth. We've lost maybe 100,000 species or so. We're not actually sure because we know so few of them. And we also care because, like I said, sort of at the beginning, forests and other ecosystems massively benefit us, our lives and our quality of life. So they're literally making it possible for us to live here by providing us clean air and clean water, by providing habitat for all of our wildlife and all of our native organisms, by sequestering and storing carbon, by regulating our climate, by mitigating and attenuating floodwaters and regulating our weather, by making our world beautiful, by creating the culture and the character of our communities. Chances are that if you love living in Vermont, that forests are at least part of the reason why. And so it's really, really important that we protect them, not just superficially, but also that we actually are doing what we can to make them healthy and resilient. Biodiversity matters. So I used to talk about, and this is sort of, a lot of us used to talk about, and many still do, about sort of like wildlife habitat. So there's like, old school forest management, it's like managing trees and managing wildlife habitat. Instead of talking about wildlife habitat, now I talk about biodiversity, because I really want to encapsulate not just the critters that are bigger and that move around and that we see and we get really excited about, like bears and deer and moose, birds of prey and stuff like that, but also everything. All the native species have a right to exist and are important, and again, are what make our forests work. So biodiversity matters for ecosystems. It's the currency of ecosystems. It makes them resilient and adaptable, both of which are qualities which are really, really important as we move into an uncertain future. We need forests that are able to remain healthy amidst this huge amount of stress and to adapt and be sort of nimble to different conditions that may arise. It's important for wildlife because the biodiversity means a bunch of different habitat types, providing habitat for a huge range of different organisms. It's really, really important for humans because it's providing us with all these ecosystem service, what we call ecosystem services or natural goods and services, the things that ecosystems provide us that make our world work and that, again, allow us to be here. And intrinsically, you could also argue, and I do, that all native organisms have the right to exist. And if you would ask most people, like, do they would say yes, but then of course we make choices that say otherwise. Okay, so that's sort of a lot of context. Now, I decided with this presentation, I wanted to get more into the treatment. And so I thought that I wasn't gonna have as much time to identify woody and then identify these species. So this is all I'm going to talk about with invasive identification of the specific species. You can scan that QR code if you want to, or you can search for it on my YouTube channel. So on my YouTube channel, just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube. There's a playlist that's about invasive plant control, and there's a webinar on it. and that has a lot more details about specifically identifying these most common invasive plants, or you can just scan that QR code and it'll pop right up. So part of tree identification as well, but also invasive plant identification is like narrowing it down, because there's a lot of different, in Vermont with tree species, there's like, there's 60, depending on who you ask, 60-ish native species of trees, but there are 10 species that account for like 80% of all the species or 85% of all the species in the state. And so, if you look at a field guide, it's going to show you 200 species of trees, and you're not going to know which you're actually more likely to find, and so you'll get confused and not know sort of where to start. So this is something that I would recommend is looking at this list here. So these are the most common invasive plants that I see. So if you're looking for, what does this plant look like? What does this plant look like? Start with these ones. Shrub honeysuckle. On our state noxious weed list, there's actually a few different species of honeysuckle, but they all look pretty much the same. So I just call them all shrub honeysuckle. Common buckthorn, Japanese barberry, Asiatic or Oriental bittersweet, glossy buckthorn, multiflora rose. Those are the ones that I see like all the time. Less common, but still prominent, and actually really prominent in individual populations throughout the state are autumn olive, Russian olive, black swallowwort, which is also called dog strangling vine in the milkweed family, and burning bush. And then so those are all woody species. So they're species that like have wood. They're shrubs or small trees. There are also a few non-woody species to be aware of. These are not things that I usually see in the woods, so I don't know as much about dealing with these species, but I'm sure that you know them. Japanese knotweed, what old timers call bamboo, Phragmites, which is also called common reed, and garlic mustard. Garlic mustard does happen in the woods. You can find more details and fact sheets on identifying all these species on vtinvasives.org, or again, you can look at that QR code. Interestingly, unlike some of these other non-native invasive organisms, pest pathogens that we have, like emerald ash borer, all of these invasive plants were introduced intentionally. And so many of them are ornamentals. So like you can still find burning bush and Japanese barberry and honeysuckle, growing in people's yards and stuff and throwing seed all over the place, even though they're a state listed noxious weed that you can no longer legally transport or sell. Bittersweet, I work with people who are not old and who remember planting bittersweet by the sides of roads and in power line corridors. And the idea is, if you don't know bittersweet, it's a vine and it like pulls everything down. And the idea was that it was going to like pull down, suppress all that roadside or in the power line corridor, all that vegetation, and make it easier to maintain. Common buckthorn and multiflora rose were planted as a living fence. The idea being you would plant this stuff along your hedgerows and you wouldn't have to maintain, your fence posts and put new fence posts in every 5 years or whatever. And I have also met people who remember folks from the state UVM extension or something coming to their farm and bringing them multiflora rose, and then I'm out there telling them they got to kill the multiflora rose, and they're like, well, you guys brought this to us 50 years ago. Another really cool tool that a lot of people, that landowners and people I work with really like, is this tool iNaturalist. This is an app. I believe it's free. And there's another one that's called Seek, but I think Seek is now owned by iNaturalist. So iNaturalist or Seek, and what these are, it's an app where you can take a picture of like anything, like a leaf, a twig, a bug, a bird, and it will tell you what it is. And if it can't tell you what it is, it will connect you with this huge network of nerds who will identify it for you in a short period of time. So it's a really good tool. Identification with these species is so important because you can't understand the extent of an infestation that you have of these species or what to do about it, or know which plant to pull up even without knowing what they look like. And so that's really, really, really important. Right now, I was also talking to Don about it, that right now is a great time to assess the invasive plant infestation on your own land or on a piece of land that you're a steward of, public land or something like that, because all of our native species have lost their leaves, and those non-natives still have their leaves. So you'll see, like, you can driving down the road, you'll see like that dark glossy green color, that's all buckthorn, or the more sort of anemic yellowish green, and that's all honeysuckle. And as you're walking through your woods, you can say, whoa, there's actually, I didn't realize that there was a patch of honeysuckle that was way over there, or a patch of buckthorn over there, or just wonder at how out of hand it's gotten. It's a really good time to do that. You can also do that early in the spring because these species are also green up first. The fact that they're able to sort of take advantage of a longer growing season is one of the reasons why, as our climate changes, we expect them to be even more successful. So one of the things that's really, really important, there's a lot of this controlling invasive plant stuff that is about like adopting the appropriate psychology, because it's really, really challenging. And it will challenge all of us in a bunch of different ways that we'll talk about. One way is that we need to become clear on what our goal is. Eradication of these plants is not going to happen. It's not an option. We just can't, and we won't. So what is our goal? Our goal is what I call control. And so what control is keeping keeping populations low enough, or getting populations to a low enough level that they're not causing a meaningful impact to our biodiversity, that we know what they look like, and that we look for them, monitor for them all the time, and that we pull them out when they show up. That is, so all of us want like an easy, thing that we can do, a relationship that we can have with these plants where it's like we flick a switch and the problem is solved, and it's just not going to be that way. And so the most progressive and responsible relationship to have with them is, especially on your own land, just know what they look like, look for them, use the right tools to get rid of them when they're there. To get to that place of control sometimes requires us to make some compromises and some tricky decisions and to do a whole lot of work. But the goal is not that you're not a failure if you do not succeed in eradicating these species from the landscape. But what we're aiming for is not that. What we're aiming for is this level of what we call control. Okay. So I think a lot about responsibility. In her amazing book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about this idea that when we are the owner of a piece of land, right, we inherit what we call a bundle of rights. So we own all the rights to this piece of land. It's like a bundle of straws that we're holding in our hand. We have the right to cut the trees, and we have the right to do this and do that and mine it and whatever. But we never talk about what responsibility we have to our ecosystem. So like this idea that, we might owe something to them, or we might be responsible to them. We might, in the same way that we're responsible to each other, right? And especially with the case of non-native invasive plants, this is a problem that, maybe you and I didn't cause, but people did. And so I view that as a place where it makes me feel responsible for the world that we have. And no one's going to do anything about it unless we do. So we need to think about, what do we owe to our ecosystems? Are we responsible for solving these problems that humans created? And should it's not going to be, but should it be simple or easy or comfortable? And I would say no. So the first step is to be proactive. Again, knowing what these plants look like is really important, and looking for them is really important. Both, no matter what, even whether you're a landowner or not, whether you own a little piece of land or a big piece of land, or you just use public lands, you can still be a steward of an ecosystem. And the most important thing is that we recognize where these plants are, and we deal with them proactively before they become a problem. The worse these infestations get, the less options we have, and that's where we have to start doing uncomfortable things like using herbicide that we don't want to do. If we see a buckthorn when it's a foot high, you can just pull it out, and it's pretty cool to be able to do that, and then not have to worry about it when it's 20 acres of buckthorn and they're all 3 inches in diameter and 10 feet tall. I really, really like when people do invasive treatment themselves. And the reason for that is not just because it's cheaper. It is cheaper, and it's really, really expensive if you want to pay somebody to come and kill the invasives, just because it's hard. But it's also, when people do it themselves, they're also more effective because they can, as they're dealing with these invasives, they can develop a relationship with them, again, learning what they look like, and then they know what to do when they crop up again in the future, and you can just deal with them then. Using the right tools, and we'll talk about what those are, and if you have tenacity, if you want to do something about it, and if you're willing to spend a little time, almost any invasive problem can be solved like just a few hours at a time. Just going out your back door. You can have the worst invasive problem, the worst honeysuckle and buckthorn problem in the world, and over a pretty big area. And if you're willing to use the right tools for the job, you can go out, before dinner, a few hours a week, and you can solve that problem. It is completely possible. And I've seen it done, and I've done it. But we need to think about, having this idea of stewardship. So again, knowing what they look like, looking for them all the time, and dealing with them before they become a problem. And so I would encourage, if you're a landowner of a piece of land of any scale, to really think about if you can do it yourself. And if you can, I think that would be better. Okay, so the first sort of school of control of invasives that we're going to talk about is what we call mechanical control. So mechanical just means not chemical. So using methods that are not herbicide to control the invasive plants. And so before I talk about these mechanical control methods, and we're going to get into this whole thing about herbicide and how surreal it is, and I'm going to tell you about how to use it and all this other stuff. But I do have to say, before I'd say this, that mechanical methods are great, and they should always be our first choice. But we also need to be realistic about when they're appropriate. So I almost hesitate to mention mechanical methods because they are almost always ineffective. I have seen them work a couple of times on invasives at any scale, and it's not because they don't work, because they totally do work. It's because the level of tenacity required to deal with these, plants that are actually really impressive plants, using these methods is a lot, and almost nobody possesses that kind of fire, to actually go out there time and time again and go after it. Okay, so as we get into mechanical control, it's also interesting, I talk a lot about sort of the pathology of people with respect to, how they think about invasive plants, which is another reason why sometimes I hesitate to talk about mechanical control at all. Most people don't even know they're there. And then they take me out on their land and they're like, I thought my land was really cool. And I'm telling them that their land has all these problems. People, even when they know they're there, most people just don't care. They don't see what the big deal is. They can't sort of zoom out and think about the bigger picture, and how they're part of this connected landscape. Even if they know and they care, they are unrealistic about how to get rid of them. So they're not willing to use the tools that are appropriate for the level of infestation that they have. And so what they end up doing is they try to use the wrong tools and they give up and they end up not doing anything. They are unwilling to use the right tools, and by the right tools, in a lot of cases, I mean herbicide, and they end up just not doing anything, and it goes wild. Or they use the wrong tools over a, they have a big infestation, but they use different controls that aren't necessarily appropriate for that level of infestation, and they control a little tiny area and everything else goes wild. So that's sort of what I usually see and what we're sort of trying to break out of with how we're thinking about invasive plants tonight. So anyway, so mechanical control consists of a bunch of different things you can do, but mostly hand pulling, cutting, burning, and smothering. So hand pulling just means you're pulling the plant out of the ground. You got to pull the whole plant out and the entire root system. So if you can't pull that plant out with the entire root system, it's not pullable. So almost every one of these plants, if you leave a piece of that root in the ground, it will sprout. And if you leave several root fragments in the ground, it could actually sprout and become multiple plants. So you need to learn with the species that you have, and different species are easier to pull out than others. Like honeysuckle is much easier to pull out of the ground than, say, buckthorn, and you can pull it out when it's a bigger plant just because it tends to be a more shallowly rooted plant. But you got to pull the whole plant out of the ground. That thing that you're seeing there in the picture is what's called a weed wrench, and that's basically a tool to help you pull out larger plants. It takes a lot more time and energy and effort, but it can help you. Spring can be a great time to pull out plants just because the soil can be so saturated, and so it's easier to get the plant and the entire root system out of the ground. I would recommend anytime that you're doing hand pulling that you should mark with a piece of flagging tape or something where you pulled, because there's such a high chance that you're going to have root fragments in the ground that are then going to sprout, that you're going to want to be able to refine that place and go back and pull sprouts maybe for multiple years, and just plan on that you're going to have to visit it a bunch of different times. With a lot of these plants, people, it's tough work, and so a lot of us want to believe that we go and we pull all these little buckthorns out or whatever, and we want it to be done, but the fact is that they're just really resilient, and it's really hard to get them completely gone. So just plan that, know in your head as you're thinking about, okay, how am I going to approach this problem, that if you're using hand pulling, you're going to have to go back a bunch of times. And you need to be realistic. So hand pulling is the best strategy. It's my favorite invasive control strategy, and it's something that we should all be doing all the time. But sometimes the plants are just too big, or there are species that are just too hard to pull, in which case it's not appropriate. So some of this can be, you can find a lot of resources on hand pulling and pulling different species and et cetera. But it's just really important. You can figure it out by trial and error as well. It's important that we're realistic. One species that I do frequently hand pull is garlic mustard. So this is a biennial herbaceous species that's often in the woods. And so what I do is with garlic mustard is I pull it. So what it does is it has two stages. It's a biennial. So the first stage is it's just like leaves growing pretty close to the ground. And then in its second year, it will shoot up this tall flowering stalk. And if you go out in late May, early June, it won't have flowered yet. And you can just pull all those garlic mustards that have that tall flowering stalk. And it's easier to pull them because they have this stalk that you can hold on to. When you pull that, you need to bag it. You need to put it in a garbage bag, and you need to either bring it to the dump, or you need to bring it to like Vermont Compost in Williston, an industrial compost facility that's rated for that kind of waste, where it can get hot enough to digest those plants without it becoming a problem. Garlic mustard can flower and go to seed as a cut plant. So if you cut it, it can still flower and go to seed somehow. These are pretty amazing plants. Because it's a biennial and because you're only pulling the ones that are flowering, this is something that you need to do for at least 2 years, because the second year, all those ones that were little on the ground are going to be flowering. So you're going to have to go back and do it again, and just plan on doing it for, more times than that. Digging. So when you're hand pulling in general, a shovel can be a great tool. Again, you need to be careful because if you're slicing roots of like a honeysuckle or a buckthorn, those are going to sprout, and you're going to get little buckthorns and honeysuckles. But if you can get the whole root system out, a shovel can be an asset. And one plant that digging, I've heard of digging being very effective with is poison parsnip. I know down in Addison County, they've been digging poison parsnip with these tools called the Parsnip Predator. This is a specially designed shovel, which is designed for poison parsnip, and severing that long taproot and getting them out. So what they do is they go out in long sleeves at dusk, because the chemical that's on poison parsnip that will burn you is photoactivated. So it will not burn you if it's not exposed to the sunlight, in theory. So you go out at dusk, you wear long clothes and gloves, and you cover yourself up. And then you dig these plants out, again, bag them and take them to the dump or take them to an industrial composting facility. And over time, they've been doing these parsnip pulling parties, and they've been making progress. So what I usually say about cutting, so cutting is you just cut the plant, and this is what, if you've tried to deal with these plants, this is probably what you've tried to do. And what I usually say is cutting doesn't work. And, with buckthorn, we say it just makes it bad. And there are some people who are trying some creative approaches to cutting, which could theoretically be successful given enough time. And so I wanted to say that if you're gonna cut, probably don't cut, because it really usually doesn't work. But if you're gonna cut the plants high. So cut them like 3 or 4 feet high, especially if it's a buckthorn, but you can also do this with honeysuckle. Cut them 3 or 4 feet high, and then come back and multiple times a year, cut off all the sprouts that are coming out of those stems. And in the case of buckthorn, probably cut that a little bit lower, and just do that again and again and again. And eventually, given enough time, you should be able to antagonize that plant to death. There's another method that I've heard about with buckthorn, and this is probably not scalable, but it's good if you just have a small area, which is you can cut it, and then when you cut it close to the ground, what it usually does is shoot out this really dense amount of sprouts from the root collar. And so what you can do is you can take like a coffee can and you can set it over that stump and push it down into the ground, so that when it sprouts, it'll sprout into the coffee can and it'll sort of sprout itself out and die. Of course, I think about people trying to do this at scale, and they're just being like hundreds of coffee cans through the woods, and it wouldn't work. But for a few plants, probably. With a species like knotweed, again, it is theoretically possible, but the research that we have suggests that you should cut it every month of the growing season, so like 7 times a year for the amount of years that it's been there. So that could be 20 years. And again, with knotweed, you got to cut them and take them to an industrial compost facility. So again, this is where we get into like, it is physically possible to control these plants using these methods, but do you have the time and the tenacity over the next 10 years to come back and cut each individual plant again and again and again and again and again, which is what you probably need to do in order to kill them. Smothering is an interesting technique. I see it used mostly for Japanese knotweed, but I've heard about it also used for Phragmites, for goutweed, for garlic mustard as well. The concept of smothering is that you basically usually just, cover those plants up, and if the plants can't get to the sunlight, they're supposed to die. What a lot of people use is they'll use heavy, like 7 mil black plastic, a layer or 2 of that over, cut back all the knotweed and then cover it in all this black plastic, and sometimes put stuff on top of the black plastic. And after 5 years, it might be dead enough. And we've sort of had mixed reports on that. Some areas that seem to have responded really well, and some areas where the knotweed has come back after that, after 5 years, and maybe you need to do it a little bit longer. I had an experience with smothering and knotweed in Underhill, where we smothered it, but I think that we covered it in 2 layers of this thick black plastic, but in putting it over these, all these like stems of knotweed that I'd cut down with the chainsaw, we poked some holes in the plastic. And so the knotweed was able to, we covered in the black plastic, covered it with all this fill from the town garage, and then the knotweed was able to find those holes and to recolonize the entire area, which is probably 200 feet by 200 feet in a year. And so you really, really need to have that thick layer of plastic. Something else, we don't know totally if this works, but something else that some people have been trying and having good success with is using hardware cloth. That's what's in this picture here, which is sort of a variation on smothering on knotweed. And the idea is that you put this hardware cloth over the patch of knotweed, and then those shoots will go up through that metal grid and will sort of girdle themselves. And given enough time, they'll eventually sort of, again, sprout themselves out and die. This is probably something that's like you would want to try in your backyard, little knotweed patch, not something that you'd want to try like, on a huge patch of knotweed by the side of the Mad River or something like that. And you probably need to do any of these things for at least 5 years. Burning is something that can be effective against some species. Mostly I've heard it used about barberry, sometimes honeysuckle. The problem is a lot of the invasive control contractors around here just don't do it anymore because it's so inefficient. It takes so much more time, and they have to be, you have to sort of do it when the ground conditions are just right without it being, for it not to be really risky. But yeah, with barberry, we know that it can work. So when is mechanical treatment appropriate? It's appropriate when you have small localized infestation, so physically small plants and a small area that's infested. When they're plants that are little, so they can be easily pulled out of the ground. Certain species are easier to control mechanically than others. The woody species are theoretically easier to control, and stuff like we talked about parsnip and garlic mustard. It can also be appropriate if you're one of these landowners who has just seemingly endless time, energy, determination, physical stamina, or money, because you can pay people to do it as well. If you're not all these things, or if you don't have an invasive problem that fits into this, these categories, this purely mechanical control is probably not right for you. That doesn't mean that elements of mechanical control, like hand pulling, or like doing different approaches in different places, isn't appropriate. It just means that you probably will have to be a little bit more creative. So the pros of mechanical control are that you're not using herbicide, no chemicals, which is better. The cons are that it's physically intense on your body. It takes a lot of time, and you got to go back again and again and again. So you sort of have to like fight your own attention span and your own level of frustration. And while it can be effective, it usually isn't, except in very specific cases. And so what I say is that you can kill them this way, but you won't. And I would invite you to prove me wrong, but I have not found that's not true. I have heard of one example of someone addressing an invasive infestation at scale, a larger infestation over a bigger area without using herbicide. I've heard of one. So I often say that treatment of invasives it's a capacity issue. So it's not about it's just about recognizing how incredibly important it is to deal with these plants, and then just being realistic about where you're at. So how much time, how much money, how much energy do you have to devote to this? What else could you be, if maybe you have enough time to deal with an invasive problem, but what else could you be doing with your time if you were doing a method that was more efficient? Are you doing that thing that we talked about, sort of controlling a small area while a larger area runs rampant? And are you setting yourself up to get frustrated? Because this is the other thing, is that you need to manage yourself, because you're the power that's going to make this thing happen. So if you just set yourself up in a position that is impossible, we all lose, because we're all going to be suffering the benefit that we all bear of having these invasive infestations, which affect us all. So chemical control means control using herbicide. And I cannot stress enough how surreal and profoundly weird it is that now I talk to people about this, because I'm not a person who's comfortable with herbicide. I eat all organic food. I do not like the way that it's used in agriculture and horticulture, which I think is completely inappropriate. However, what I've realized in dealing with this and seeing the severity of the problem and how these tools can be used as restoration tools, I have realized that our ability to use herbicide in a super minimal, targeted way, not as the answer, but as a part of our solution to these invasive plant problems, is how we're going to solve the problem, because it actually works. And that's the reason why virtually every conservation organization in the state uses them. Some of them don't make a big deal about it, and I wish they would, because it would make me feel less lonely. But we all use them, and we use them not because we're dummies or because we're insensitive or because we're completely cool with herbicide. We use them because we work, and we know that we can do it in a way that is not harmful. So that what we're talking about, what I'm going to talk about, and there's a few different variations on this that I'm not going to talk about, but what I'm going to talk about is cut stump treatment, which is my favorite kind of chemical control, foliar spray, and snip and drip. So when is chemical treatment appropriate? So it is appropriate when you have larger infestations, larger than like a backyard level infestation, larger plants that you can't pull by hand, certain species like knotweed that are too difficult to control using other methods. And if you're just like, I don't have the time and the energy and the capacity to devote to these really other energy and time and money intensive methods. So cut stump treatment, this is my favorite. So this is cut stump treatment, and you can scan that QR code there and watch a short video that I made about using this tool that I love called the buckthorn blaster. This is where you cut the stem of the plant. You can do it anytime except for the spring. So like all winter up until like March through mid-May is the only time you can't do it. Any other time is good. And what you do is you cut the stems, and then you take this buckthorn blaster, which is a bingo dauber. There's actually a picture of it in this slide right here. So it's this bingo dauber. It has a little sponge tip right there. And you fill it up with herbicide, concentrate, glyphosate probably, and a dye. And you cut the stems, and then you just sponge onto the surface of that stump. And you kill it. It's dead. And you use probably 1/1000th of an ounce of herbicide. So you'll have one of those buckthorn blasters. It doesn't spill. It's purely applied by that sponge. And you're using a teeny tiny little amount of herbicide. And, like probably there's 2 ounces of herbicide concentrate in there, 2 ounces of water. With 2 ounces of herbicide, you can treat hundreds and hundreds of plants. So it's super, super minimal, super targeted, because it's only applied to the cut surface of that stump. And what it does is translocate throughout the plant, and it kills it. And I'm just a believer in this. It's just amazing. You go into the woods, and, on my own land, I carry it with me all the time. I actually carry it on my person when I'm working all the time, because you find one plant and it's in the middle of nowhere. It's too big to hand pull, and you're never going to find it again. And so you can just take care of it with, again, 1/1000th of an ounce of herbicide, and it's done. And that the buckthorn blaster too, as a tool, it's just this, you should watch that video, because it's just really, it embodies the relationship that I want to have with herbicide, which is, again, this is not something that you have to be completely comfortable with, and it's not something that I'm completely comfortable with. It's a restoration tool that we're using to promote biodiversity and all of these other beautiful things that we believe in. And I actually think of it as, in this context, I think of the use of herbicide as profoundly subversive, because we're using a tool that was created really to suppress biodiversity to protect it. Foliar spray, This is a little bit harder for people to wrap their heads around. It is something that I use. It's a much more diluted concentration, so 2 to 4% herbicide that you're applying to leaves during the growing season. I use on my own land a little hand pump 3-gallon backpack sprayer. Even though it's less targeted, obviously, than applying herbicide directly to the surface of that stump, it still can be really surgical. And there's a really cool project that we did on the La Platte Headwaters Town Forest in Heinsberg, where you can see, is buckthorn that was growing with young trees of all these different species, and we treated it with a foliar spray, and only the buckthorn is dead. And we were really, really happy with that. It's a really good demonstration of how foliar spray can be done really, really well. We're not fogging the forest, it's being applied to the leaves of individual plants. Again, on a very small concentration. It's something that is easier to use. I used it on my land because I had just acres and acres and acres of this plant, Japanese barberry, that has a lot of little stems. So I could have done cut stump application, but I would have had to treat for each plant. I would have maybe had to treat 20 or 30 stems, and it would have just been really inefficient. So that would be an example of when this would be appropriate. And it's something that it's like we need to take it really serious and be really careful with it. Don't apply to really tall plants where you're reaching up like this, because then you're going to have herbicide drifting all over the place, and that is something that we absolutely do not want. We want it to be as targeted as possible. Don't apply when it's windy. Don't apply when there's rain in the forecast. The snip and drip method is also, it's a funnily named method. It's something that is used on knotweed and Phragmites. The idea basically being that, and knotweed, I should say, is the hardest invasive plant to kill. It's almost impossible to kill. But it seems like you can have some success if you treat each cane of knotweed individually. So if you, either with a stem injection, which it would have to be a professional doing that because it's a special tool, or this snip and drip method, it seems like you can get some control over them. So what you do is you basically cut the cane, and then you actually drip in like a few milliliters of herbicide into the hollow stem of each individual cane. And you can do that for Phragmites as well. And what we end up using in practice, again, remembering that herbicide is not the goal. Herbicide is a tool that helps us achieve our goal, which is control. And the real goal is promoting healthy forests, healthy ecosystems, habitat, biodiversity. And it's sort of a tool that we want to use to make that tool no longer need to be used, to get populations of invasives down to a level where we can deal with them without using it. But it will be, it will be part of how if we're going to solve this problem in a meaningful way across our landscape, it will be part of how we do that. But in practice, that doesn't mean that has to be the only thing. What I do on my own land most of the time is I hand pull most of the time, and I do cut stump treatment only when they're plants that I can't hand pull. So if I even like try to hand pull one, break off a piece of root, I'll treat that piece of root, just so I know that it won't sprout. Or if I just encounter a plant that's too big, I'll just cut it and treat it. But most of the time, I'm just pulling by hand. Hand pulling some species that are easier to hand pull, knowing which species are harder to hand pull and just treating those. Or there are some other, creative methods for like cutting areas where invasives are really dense and then treating the sprouts, or sort of, that's sort of the next level up is thinking creatively about how to make invasives more treatable using stuff like grinding and cutting that we don't need to get into. Because I talked about herbicide, you should know that this is something we regulate in Vermont, as we should. The label of the herbicide, which on most herbicides is like a little booklet, that's the law. You can apply some herbicides, such as glyphosate, which is the one that I normally recommend, on your own land. On anybody else's land, you need to be a licensed applicator. And if you're interested, the Agency of Agriculture offers a licensed applicator course, which I would recommend for anyone who thinks that it would make them feel more comfortable or just wants to know a little bit more. I just think there are so many things in forest stewardship where, nobody said it was going to be easy, right? We inherit these forests, and they're complicated, and they're profoundly altered, incredibly, incredibly altered, degraded, exploited, and to rise to that occasion and to address that legacy that we didn't create, to address that legacy requires us to make really tough decisions, and more stuff like controlling invasives feels like some of the most important and profound work, and it's also the most challenging, frustrating, time-consuming, intense work that we do. But it's worth it, and it really, really is the right thing to do. And every time I meet a landowner who's actually doing something about it, who's being realistic and using the right tools, which is almost never, but increasingly more and more, I do see people doing it. I say thank you, right? Because this is something that is protecting those goods that we all benefit from in common. A good resource for you, btinvasives.org, has lots more information about invasives in general, invasive plants, but also invasive organisms like the emerald ash borer and all kinds of other interesting resources. Other resources, there is some cost share funding for pieces of land through the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, the EQIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which might be appropriate on some of you who have not tiny pieces of land, but smallish pieces of land. There's a great guide that was put out by the Nature Conservancy that you can search for, which is called the Vermont Landowner's Guide to Invasive Terrestrial Plant Management. It's an awesome resource. If you live in Vermont, you have a county forester, and you can just give us a call and we'll come out and take a walk with you and talk about what's going on in your woods. You can just search for Vermont County Foresters online. For me, I've been doing, in addition to this, I have this YouTube channel, and I have this email list where I let people know about the events I'm doing, and you can read articles. I write this like monthly column for a bunch of newspapers in the county, and do a bunch of other stuff. So if you scan that QR code or you go to my link tree, that link tree is just a place where you can see a bunch of links about stuff that I'm working on. Sign up for my email list, check out the YouTube channel, etc. And that is it. So I would love to, I'm sure that you all have questions, and I would love to answer them. Let's see what we got here. Almi says, oh, hey, Almi. Almi says, I use the app Picture This to ID plants. It's quite good at IDing. It doesn't give me much invasive type info. So that's another app to check out. Another book about the biological interactions, biochemicals, air, soil, is the Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wollhaven. That's not my favorite, but I know a lot of people like that one.
What do you like better?
My favorite book about forests is, and I always get it mixed up because there's so many things that, so my problem, this is like a personal thing, and with some other foresters that I work with as well, is just that book, The Hidden Life of Trees, it's based on a lot of like really important tree research, and especially the work of Dr. Susan Simard, who has pioneered this sort of field of understanding, especially the way that forests can often be cooperative, in addition to being competitive. And they can share, especially with this mycorrhizal fungal network, they can like share resources, and there's all this cool stuff going on. That book tends to take that science and sort of expand on it. So like adding a lot of other stuff about like anthropomorphizing trees and sort of guessing in what ways trees are like people, which is not, it's cool because it connects people with forests, but it's not always actually accurate, what he's talking about. So which is important to note. But the one I really like is, and I'm gonna make sure that I don't tell you the wrong name, John R. Luoma. I believe it's the hidden forest. Hold on. Yeah, it's called The Hidden Forest, Biography of an Ecosystem. It's great. It's an easy read. It's about mostly forests in the Pacific Northwest, but most of the stuff they're talking about totally holds with the Northeastern forest as well. And it's by John Luoma. And that one is just like so cool. There's a lot of like really great forest books around there. One of the other ones I mentioned, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. Yeah, is really, really important. Braiding Sweetgrass, I also mentioned, by Robin Wall Kimmerer, is a book sort of about the land ethic and specifically with an indigenous perspective. Of course, like Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold is always a classic. There's a lot of them there. I've actually been working on a reading list. I'll think about if there's some more good ones to recommend. Mimi asks, what pesticide chemical spray do you recommend for garlic mustard? So when I do a foliar spray, and like I said, with garlic mustard, I have used a foliar spray just where it was too overwhelming to pull it all by hand. But normally I do hand pull garlic mustard, but for most of these plants, what I'd recommend is using glyphosate, which is a whole nother ideologically, a thing that people have to get past when they think about this stuff, because that's the active ingredient in Roundup. And Roundup is the most widely used herbicide in the world. And we have all these concerns about it from a human health perspective. It is used thoughtfully and carefully, and not like, sprayed across a 100-acre field onto a stream. It is by far the most environmentally benign herbicide that we have. And the reason for that is because it breaks down really quickly in the environment. It doesn't leach into our water, so it bonds strongly to soil particles. So even if the soil particle were to become mobilized in that water, the glyphosate wouldn't just leach into the waterways. It doesn't bioaccumulate, and it doesn't have soil activity, which means it doesn't kill other non-target plants through the soil. So that's why we use glyphosate. And there's the funny thing that happens where people have heard of glyphosate, and so then they go to the hardware store and they see like dicamba or something like that on the shelf, which is a terrifying herbicide, but they haven't heard of it. And they have heard of the glyphosate, so they buy the dicamba. I understand the weirdness of using the glyphosate, but it is the one that I'd recommend. Teresa asked, hey Teresa, why are there more ticks in areas with invasives? The thought is that, especially with Japanese barberry, but also with other invasives, that they create these like very dense thickets. If you've been in areas that are really, really infested, you'll know this, and that those areas harbor higher populations of rodents, which are carriers of ticks in their nymph stage. So especially white-footed mice. So that's the thought, is that they create areas where those rodents can find protection, and then those rodents carry the ticks, and you get more ticks. Katerina asks, what's best for honeysuckle cut stump or foliar spray? We have lots growing on the slopes of a ravine. My thought would be, I would use a combination of different things. Honeysuckle is actually pretty easy to pull. You should try pulling some. It also depends on the soil it's growing into. You should try pulling some of it. And if you can pull it, what I would do, depending on how big of an area is, I would pull the little ones and I would cut stump treat the big ones. Honeysuckles, if you use herbicide, is actually pretty easy to kill. It's just, really prolific at growing. Again, you could also, if it's a bigger area, you could incorporate some foliar spray into that as well, but it's pretty easy to pull. So I would just treat the bigger ones with cut stump. Eleanor said, I just pulled out numerous multiflora rose bushes, but I know it will sprout in the spring. When that happens, can I then apply directed herbicide? Yes. Multiflora rose is really, really tenacious. Sometimes you'll find like a little plant will be like 2 inches high and it'll have a root system that I literally can't pull out of the ground. It's so intense. And so what I would do is when it sprouts, I would, treat the sprouts. And again, my preference would be just snip each little stem and dab a little bit of herbicide on the cut surface of the stem with the buckthorn blaster. And that should do it. Sometimes when there's a lot of little stems, like if you had acres and acres and acres of a lot of little stems, it probably wouldn't be efficient to treat each individual stem, or you couldn't treat each individual stem, which is when you would turn to something like a foliar spray. But and when they do sprout like that, if you have like when you cut a buckthorn low and it produces that incredible mass of sprouts, that's actually a pretty a relatively easy and safer thing to foliar spray, because you're spraying, it has a ton of leaf area. You can just hit that area with the spray, and then you're spraying really low to the ground, so there's less of a risk that it's going to spread all over the place. Like if you were, and don't do this, if you are spraying something over your head, all those little herbicide particles are getting everywhere. So you want to treat as close to the ground as you can. Oh yeah, someone mentioned also Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. That's a great book. More of a memoir of Suzanne Simard, but she is such a resource to our community. That's a great book. Finding the Mother Tree, it's called. And that's a new one that's out. And she's so great because one of the things that happens, again, she's the person who basically like was able to figure out all this stuff that now really, if you loved forests anyway, maybe you had an idea, you're like, these trees are connected. But then she actually found it, and it's hard science. It's part of, how in our scientific literature, how we manage forests, how we take care of them, how we think about them now. And she has such a great balanced perspective. Suzanne Simard also has, I should add, an awesome TED Talk. So if you search for Suzanne Simard TED Talk, it's like a 10 or 15-minute talk that she gives, which is all about how trees and forests communicate with each other. Susanna wanted to share that they had some success pulling out larger buckthorn roots, which couldn't be pulled out by hand, with a chain attached to the back of the truck. Yeah, just wanted to share that, she says. That's great. I've heard of people having some success, a few plants on your hedgerow or something like that, pulling them out with the tractor, pulling them out with the buckthorn roots, just knowing that you're probably going to have to go back and treat some of those sprouts that come from the root fragments. But yeah, you can get creative. It's just the only problem with doing that is that, if you have a ton of plants way back in the woods, you can't necessarily get to each individual one of them with the tractor or with the truck. So just knowing where that's appropriate and where it's not. Katerina says, what do we do with the honeysuckles when they're pulled? So the traditional thing that I was taught, that we're supposed to do is that, you pull out these little plants and then you hang up in a tree. And the joke is that you hang them up in a tree as a warning to other invasive plants, don't come here. But the real reason is it's so the root system dries out and so it doesn't resprout. Some of these invasive plants, the one that really is really virulent and can really sprout from a little piece of root or cut stem is Japanese knotweed, which is sort of in a whole league by its own. Honeysuckle also can, and some of these other ones also can and will occasionally, if you lay a piece of stem on the ground or a piece of root on the ground, it'll put down these roots, which are called adventitious roots, these little thread-like roots into the ground, and it'll reroot. But people spend so much time worrying about that, and it really doesn't happen that much. So what I tell people is, again, it's about managing your capacity. So people like spend all this time cutting these, disposing of these plants, like chipping them and piling them, and they use all this, they're like using 10% of their time to actually kill plants and 90% of their time to deal with them. Just cut them and leave them on the ground. Don't do anything. Just do that, and like, 1 in 50 is going to reroot, and when it reroots, you'll deal with it then. But instead of worrying about it, just take the time that you were going to do that and just kill more invasive plants. With a lot of this stuff, it's just like, it's just such a problem that we just gotta deal with it with the time that we have. Same thing, like, for cut stump treatment, the best time to do it is in the late fall or late summer, early fall. So like August through October, that's the best time. But, and it's like 95% effective, but it's like 92% effective every other time, all winter, all summer, every time, again, except for that early spring, like March through early May. And so what I tell people is, people are all worried about only treating these invasives during that window when it's the best. And I say, just do it when you have time and just get it done. Don't, like, if you have 2 hours and it's not the early spring, go kill invasives. Let's see, what else do we have? After pulling, G said, after pulling invasives, would a strategy be to plant trees or native plants in that area to prevent the invasives from coming back? So that is something that definitely, I think, I was at a place in Charlotte. There might be some people from there here tonight. I was at a place in Charlotte today where there's just a lot of these invasives. In some areas, it's like only invasives. And these invasives, in addition to just sort of taking over, they can also have these allelopathic influences on the soil, which can make it hard for new plants to colonize. In forestry, we're really not used to planting trees here because our forests and other ecosystems are so resilient that all we have to do is like create space. You create a little hole in the canopy and it just fills with regeneration. It's the profound gift of having these really, really resilient forests. And so that would always be my first choice with invasives. But in the case of some of these areas that are really, really badly infested, some planting might really help. And, it helped for a couple different reasons, sort of start that new generation and also to sort of take up that space to prevent future infestations. So like my friend David Paganelli, who's the Orange County Forester, he has areas in his forest that they're areas where it's a really good site for growing rich site hardwoods like sugar maple and white ash, basswood, stuff like that. But he has this really bad invasive problem. And so he plants white pine, which is, not really going to be successful there in the long term. He plants white pine into openings in the canopy just to basically take up that space so that the invasives can't take up that space. That would be a little bit more of an involved approach. That would not be appropriate for every area. Most areas, if you just kill the invasives, the native stuff will come back in. Someone asked, Sam asked, can you use the buckthorn blaster on non-woody species such as wild parsnip? Buckthorn blaster, I don't think so. You can use herbicide on them. You can use a foliar spray of herbicide. But I haven't dealt with those field plants like loosestrife or, knapweed or poison parsnip that much. So I think you'd have to do some research on that before I could tell you. Let's see. Oh yeah, can buckthorn blaster be used on grapevine? So grapevine is a weird one. Let me just get a drink of water before I talk about this. So grapevine, it's a native plant. Actually, so we have two native vines, two native woody vines that are grapevine and Virginia creeper. And now if you have like a yard or a home or a hedgerow, you might have seen these two vines, both of which can behave very invasively. They definitely do have a role in our ecosystems. you know, like grapevine, for instance, provides, and actually Virginia creeper also provides berries that are eaten by birds and are nutritious. But they're one of this weird select group of species that are native, but can sort of behave invasively and can be a biodiversity threat in response to human created conditions. So we create these, especially in the case of grapevine, we create these young degraded forests that are trying to regenerate, or we create these hedgerows, edges, which is a pretty unnatural thing actually to have in the forest that we didn't used to have. They can actually, you know, be a legitimate biodiversity threat. Basically what they do is they grow over everything and just pull everything down. And so in the case of wild grape, where it's doing that, where it's not just in the woods being a vine, but where it's on an edge, where it's in an impaired forest and preventing that forest from growing and recovering and regenerating, I will either cut it, or you could theoretically cut it and treat it with a buckthorn blaster, with a cut stump application. I would cut it and I would see if that does it, or if it's behaving really invasively. I think it would be reasonable to use that on that. Another species like that is sumac. Staghorn sumac is a native species that was used by native people for a bunch of different stuff, including to make sap spouts. They would take a twig and hollow out the pith, stick it in a slit in a sugar maple tree, which was the original sap spout. But in response to these edges that we've created, it can be very aggressive and very invasive. And I've treated it like an invasive on my own land in a couple of cases because it was interfering with the ability of these degraded areas to revert back to forest. I think that's it, guys. Any other questions about any of this stuff? I'd recommend, so if you check out my link tree or that video on the YouTube channel that's about using the buckthorn blaster, you're welcome, if you have specific questions, you're welcome to shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat. And I'll see if I can answer your questions. I'm like a big picture person, so I'm not necessarily plugged into the minutia of every single species in the world, but I do think I have a pretty good handle on, you know, as both a forest manager and also a landowner who has dealt with a pretty extensive invasive problem, to give you some specific tips. And I want to just thank you all. Oh, Mimi asked, where can we get a list of county foresters? Just search for Vermont County Foresters online. It'll show up, Mimi. Oh, and now Katarina asks, how long does it take for buckthorn roots to die after treated? They are big. I'd like to plant other trees at their place in the meadow. I would think it would, you know, a few years, something like that. They'll be pretty well gone. Oh, so the last thing I just want to say is that the biggest thing with all these dealing with all these plants is getting started, right? So like just understanding that this is like, that these plants are a big deal and that they're worth our time, you know, to protect our ecosystems, to protect our forests, to protect our biodiversity to deal with. And so thank you all for being here and for taking at least that first step in trying to do something about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don. With that, I'll say good night to everybody.
Good night.
Thanks for coming.